All right, so it is Tuesday. Guys, it's August 20th. We're like 2/3 of the way through the year already. Hopefully you're 2/3 of the way on to your goal. So today's hot topic, thank you all for joining me. Hopefully this is a little bit of an open topic for us. And what we know is that we want to talk, well, last week's topic, negotiation. There is now the time where we really know, one, the how to negotiate. If you missed that, please go back to last week's deep dive. I had Adam South in from Anywhere Corporation, Adam on the Century 21 side he specializes in. Adam did a fantastic job of really teaching and showing how to negotiate. Now we've got to look at, okay, sticking in with the hot topic of its negotiation and the settlement. So how do we do a presentation to the seller of the contract and these changes that have come up? More importantly is, how do we do this with a buyer? Because we know with the terms of the settlement that we have to have the buyer sign an agreement prior to touring homes with us as a realtor. Okay, so those are some of the key things. Let me pull up then first, and guys, I won't say I'm winging this, but I'm going to wing it a little bit because I'm just going to have the agreement. Matter of fact, let me pull that up first. Okay, everybody should be looking at the exclusive listing contract. I'm showing no bias, but I happen to be in the Shelby Township office today, so working with them on some of these things. Here's the exclusive listing contract. Now, what I want you guys to
Darwin,
know.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, I don't see the contract.
Oh, you're not? Then I haven't shared, right? Thank you. Sounds like Deanna. And we got it now?
Yes, thank you.
Thumbs up. All right. Thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I'm looking at two different places. I'm actually seeing the same screen. So the exclusive listing contract. If you've been using this, here's what you'll know. Very little has changed in regards to this agreement. Here's where the changes happen. And these changes happen basically around the February 1st timeframe. What we know is we didn't call it a record retention fee or a broker compliance fee. We simply said, here's the listing broker's compensation. It is blank percent or blank dollars and $395 or $195 if it's a lease, because we use the same document. So this has been out there since the first of the year. We've combined that fee so that the compensation is kept simple. We also know that at the beginning of the year, and this was a change due to the settlement, that we had to build in and get authorization from the seller as to whom we could offer cooperation and compensation to. Now, there's a slight change with the latest revision of this, and that is we went from having two spots to say yes or no to just initial if you're authorizing it. We know that B and C is the two areas where we want to offer compensation and cooperation. So if we get our full 6% up here, then we want them to initial B and C. Okay? And it would say that you're authorizing us to offer compensation to a buyer's broker at 3% or blank dollars. And blank, one of the most common is because of the lease. You may have a flat fee for that. If so, you can use that. C is if it's a transaction coordinator. Again, offer the same amount. A transaction coordinator has the same, it's a licensed realtor. Let me rephrase that. Is a licensee who represents neither the buyer or the seller, and therefore has no fiduciary duties to either of the two parties, yet they're doing all the things necessary to complete a real estate transaction. If the only thing they're lacking is fiduciary duties, but they're doing all the other work, pay them what they're worth. Guys, we want to offer compensation. We don't care who. And there are reasons to be able to do it, but that's the reason those two things are in there. The only other thing that was added was paragraph 6, where it's clearly now concessions toward closing costs, taxes, prepaids, any allowable expense. Okay? Now, if we look at it and we go from the two simple changes that have occurred, do either of them actually impact this? And the answer is yes. We can no longer promote in the MLS the offer of compensation. But does it really change my presentation to the seller? And the answer is no. So I want you to see it from this direction then. I'm going to do what I've always done. I set the appointment with the seller. I do the same presentation I've always made, where I'm asking lots of questions. I'm finding the problems, the issues, the concerns. I'm then going to offer and become the solution to the problems and the issues that they've faced. And then I'm going to close upon them. And my close is probably going to be, so based on everything we've talked about, I'm sure I can assume that you want to list a home with me. The only question would be, what price do you feel that we ought to put on the home to get somebody to buy your home versus the competition? Now, do what you've always done. Maybe it can improve, but I'm going to say do what you've always done. They can then put the price in the listing agreement. We'll review. Here's the price we just agreed upon. Here's the terms under which we're offering. Here's what you said you were leaving on personal property. Here's my compensation. You'll notice that it's 6% plus $395. By the way, I don't add anything to this. The next one is where you're authorizing that I'm able to, matter of fact, let me pull it back up just so that you can see, because this is literally how we should be doing it. So here's all the personal property. You said there's nothing that you're planning to leave that we need to take out beforehand. Here's my 6% plus $395. In this section right here is what we're doing is you're going to authorize me to offer 3% out to a buyer's broker and to a transaction coordinator. I'm going to offer 3%. I just need the initial each one of those. Great. Seller concessions, we've talked about that. We're saying that we're not going to do any concessions and therefore it won't be disclosed in the MLS, but we are participating in the multiple listing service. You're agreeing to do the title. By the way, do you need me to keep going through all of this, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, or would you like me to just get to, okay. One, I got to clarify, I just got to make sure you are a United States citizen. Is that correct? Guys, ask this because if they're not, it doesn't create problems, but it's something that the title companies need to know. If they're not a legal no, let me rephrase that. If they're not a United States citizen, there's other things that have to be taken care of at closing. So don't breeze over this. Don't assume. Check that both sellers are United States citizens. This just says you can't do that. You know, showings. Guys, I'm covering this as if, but I'm going to avoid this because you all know how to handle the conflict inventory, blah, 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 yada, yada. We've hit that. There's FERPTA. I go any additional conditions that I might have thrown in. Do you have any other questions? And they do this. Great. Who wants to go first? And we hand them the pen. What I'm trying to illustrate through all of this is when it comes to the presentation of the seller, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Do not make a big deal out of this settlement. You don't even need to talk about it unless if they bring it up, because it's all in the paperwork. Keep it simple, do what you've always done. Don't make a big deal out of this. Keep it simple, salespeople, everything's normal, okay? Now, if
Darwin,
that's
can I
good,
ask a question?
yep, Renee, thank you. I was just gonna open it up for that before we move on.
I heard you say too, that they would initial all the spots, but they're just initialing the spots that are pertaining.
Yes, we're
Okay.
gonna have them initial, here's our preference. We don't want to offer sub-agency, so they would not initial the first one. They would initial the second and third, buyer broker, transaction coordinator, and obviously D was the most recent addition where if it was a zero and not author or authorize the compensation. So only initial the ones that they're authorizing. You corrected me, yes. Okay. Any other questions on the listing agreement? Looks like we're all set there.
I have a question real quick, Darwin.
Go,
The
boss.
195 transaction fee for a lease. I've been asked a couple of times now for the exact date that became effective. Can you help me with that?
When it ended up in this contract. That's the best answer.
Okay.
All right, Darwin,
So for
Everyone-
blue, by the way, it's always been in there. But yes, when this contract came out, it's actually been out there. It's part of the policy and procedure, but hard to charge somebody when it's not in the contract.
Darwin,
Yes, sir.
I was the one that asked Brenda about that because
It would be you, Larry.
of course, I wouldn't want to disappoint you. The contract I had was dated June 12th, and I looked at it this morning and it was not part of the listing contract at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, so frankly, I wouldn't worry about it. And no, you shouldn't be charged for it because it really wasn't out there. It was kind of an inconsistent. So go with it if it's on the contract. Now, yeah, this, you said June, so no, this wasn't out there at that point.
So my question,
You're safe.
my next question is that even when it's out there on a listing, where is it going to be put on the closing sheet? On who pays
Well,
it?
for a lease, we as the agents close these, so it's up to us. And by the way, I'm guilty, and believe me, I had to pay a few of these because I forgot to collect it, and I took all of their money just to get them into it. So I wasn't going to go back after them. But it would be up to us, the listing, or if we have them as the tenant. It's up to us as part of the closing finances to make sure that we collect it.
Well, on that closing sheet, I think it would behoove C21 that has that on a line item so it can be spelled out when given to them.
I'm going to say, I'm looking to somebody, Brenda, maybe because it's your pain in the neck here, could you, or Larry, either one of Larry, send me that document, because that may be something that we should put together, would actually be out there on a full company basis, because I don't think what you're referring to does everyone have.
If Larry is
So-
talking about the pending closing document, that 195 is on there now?
Are you, is it on there? Are we talking broker requirement? Or the like the
it's-
settlement statement?
The settlement statement, it's on there. Who's paying it? It's the 395 or the 195
Yeah.
buyer seller.
So, yeah, we'll keep it simple for now. Send it to me, because I don't think that's something that's out there exposed to all offices or all agents. And then we can potentially get that uploaded so that everybody would have it. Because that would simplify it and ease the potential that we might forget that. So, good one. All right, I am going to move then to the buyer agency. So here's what I'm going to share with you on this one, guys. Matter of fact, let me remind everyone, because I did it with a gang here in Shelby Township today. The mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. The other part is if you can have a little amnesia and forget what you used to do with buyers. If you try to do what we need to do today with what you used to do in the past, it will be really hard. Because if you will, you almost have to do this when somebody approaches you and go, "Psst." That's my finger in front of your face. Don't say anything. One, I'm going to represent you. Two, sign that. And I'll sign this one that says you're going to pay me 3%. Anybody know anyone that would do that when they don't even know them? Matter of fact, even take our sphere of influence. If we dropped those two documents and what we're talking about, agency disclosure, buyer representation agreement, on them before they even said a word, even your sphere of influence, how many of them would sign it? Okay. What we've done in the past, we cannot do. What we must do moving forward is to do a buyer agency, or excuse me, a buyer interview. What we've done with sellers, we now need to do with buyers. Okay. Now, I know what's running through your head. It's like, you know, here, can I do the whining thing with that? But Darwin, there's going to be buyers that I don't know, and they call in and they just want to see a house. Otherwise, they do this. Just show me the damn house. I just want to see the house. Can you not just show me the house? I'll call the listing agent. Okay. That's the one that you got to handle. So let's take that one and keep it really simple. Okay. I do everything. Now let's start at the beginning. So I may say, hey, Diane, because I got her name and I got a little bit of information. I probably even got some confidential information out of her. Everybody knows why I'm smiling, I'm sure, because they know that we violated things. But here it is. I say, so Diane, are you familiar with the new, the recent updates in regards to real estate? Well, no, what do you mean? Well, have you heard anything about this settlement and how and what it means to you as a buyer? No. Well, here's the wonderful part of what the DOJ and the bureaucrats and the money-hungry attorneys have done for you. They've now made it to where you're forced to sign an agreement with me for me to even show you homes. Now, honestly, I got to tell you, I don't know what they're going to say. But my guess is it's not me making them do it. It's the recent developments. It's what the government, the DOJ, what the bureaucrats, the attorneys, it's what they've done to them, not us. They're making sure that you know how I work and how we get paid. Okay. So if it's all right with you, I'll be happy to show you the house, but let me ask you this. Now, these are the important questions, guys, because this is the part where you got to have some fortitude and know what your worth is. If I show you this house and you decide to buy it, will you buy it from me? What's the answer I want? Yes. Great. And if you buy it from me, will you make sure that I get paid? Well, how's that work? You know what? That's a great question. Why don't we do this? Let's meet at the McDonald's around the corner 10 minutes before. So I'm going to say set point at 4:30. Matter of fact, let's meet at 4:15. I'll review what we need to do, update you, and we'll make sure that, you know, the agreement you got is only for this one house. Okay? That's how you got to handle it with that individual. How you got to handle it with that one individual. And if they won't sign, you don't show because you don't get paid. Let me say that. They won't sign, you don't show because you won't get paid. The changes got it really simple. If you're going to get paid, the buyer is the one who's signing to make sure that happens. How that happens is a different story. I got a question here.
But Darwin, what if the listing agent, the seller is offering 3% to the buyer?
Oh, now hopefully you heard John, but here's what John said, but Darwin, what if I could get the 3% from the listing broker because I checked with them to see if they were offering? Well, my question to answer that question would be, what have you signed with that listing broker? But guess what? It doesn't matter. The buyer is the one who's going to pay you. It's the buyer. It's the buyer. What did you sign with them? And in our scenario, we sign nothing, therefore we get nothing. Guys, you've got to have a signed agreement. Now, here's how we're going to handle that scenario. Our latest version, paragraph 1, real clear change. You guys can see it here, right there. First part, any real property in the state of Michigan. So they sign a contract with you, you're it. And it's real property, so vacant land also. The second one provides the lines for the following specific properties. Here's where you could put 1, 2, 3 Easy Street, 1, 2, 3, 4 Overview. So if you showed them 1 or if you showed them 5 specific properties and they didn't want to go beyond that, at least the work you've done for those, you get paid if they buy one of those. Okay? Compensation of the broker. So this is a key part of the presentation. We've earned the right, we're reviewing the contract, and we say, now, I get 3% plus $395. This is where if I do my job correctly and my negotiating skills are very strong, instead of you pulling this out of your pocket, I'm sure you don't want to do that, do you? And shake your head so that they, no, I don't want to do that. Then the easiest way for me to do this is to collect it through the seller. So when you make your offer, you're going to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we need you to contribute 3% of the purchase price to be applied toward my buyer's broker's fee. So we're just building into the transaction where it's always been.
Paragraph 5, compensation credit.
Yep, and John just pointed it out. So guys, you can see it here. Paragraph 5, buyer will receive any credit that I receive from the listing broker or the seller is going to be credited toward the amount you owe me. So we're just always going to make sure that I get my 3%. That's what we'll negotiate in as part of the purchase agreement. Okay? Now, what happened prior to this if this was someone else? If this was, my friend Lori called me up and said, Darwin, we're going to buy a house. I go, fantastic. We asked a few questions. She's only buying a house. We get together, but I started with, hey, how familiar are you with the developments, recent developments in real estate? Well, what do you mean? Have you heard anything about how you and I have to work with each other in the future? Oh, wow. So let's do this. Our next best step is we need to get together. Let me explain everything that's going on and what I'm going to do to help you find your new home and get it for you at the lowest possible price. Is she going to say, no, we're old friends? She's going to say, oh, great. And we get together, preferably in the office. I don't care if it's at Tim Hortons down the road or if it's not near here. I could go to the Clinton Township office. I could go to Lake Orion. I could look if I was crazy enough to go to Midland. Nothing against Midland people. But if I was crazy enough to drive that far and not want to refer it for some reason, I could meet them at the office, right? We can meet them in any of our offices. But that's where we want to meet first and explain the whole process, do the showing, get them set up with a preferred partner in regards to the mortgage, get that taken care of first, or if they're going to pay cash, that they bring me their proof of funds for that meeting, okay? And then I'm going to walk them through and tell them everything I'm going to do to help them find their new home as part of the purchasing process and how it works. But the best example I can give, guys, to earn your value, is unlisted properties, because here's what we just all agreed to it here today, about 20 of us. Did I do a count like they do at church? Yes. Might have been inflated by just a couple. They rounded off. If I go every day and knowing what it is this buyer's looking for, and I'm calling on FSBOs, expireds, withdrawals, I'm out knocking on doors in the neighborhood that they said that they want to live in. I send out flyers, mailers to the neighborhood that they say they want to be in. I'm networking with all of my friends throughout all of the offices. And I find a buyer, a home that is not on the market. They can now go in, go, ooh, we love it, let's buy it. Even if they had to pay the full asking price. And let's call it market value. Because there's no competition. How much money might we have saved? Say on a, I don't know, we'll use the $300,000 house again. Here's common, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Have you heard about the market? So you know that if we find a really nice house like what you're looking for, that it's not unusual for these homes to sell for $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 above the asking price. If you had no competition and all you had to do, let's say that we couldn't negotiate, because I'm representing only you. Let's say we couldn't negotiate and you paid the asking price of $300,000. How much do we save you, even if it was $20,000? And I'm charging you 3%. Do the math real quick. 3 times 300, $9,000. 9,000 from 20,000. Guys, it was a great investment in you, because you only cost them $9,000. As a matter of fact, some other day, I keep planting seeds on this. You might pay me $15,000 if I could do that, and that would be 5%, because I'm representing only the seller, or only the buyer in this case, because I found them an unlisted property. And that's just one of the things that we do. So that's the simplicity of this. Any questions there? Because we're right at 12:30 and I want to just do a quick review of the purchase agreement.
Hey, Darwin, I have a question. It's Jen.
Yeah, Jen.
Hey, okay, so I just want to confirm, when I do a buyer's agreement with the buyer and they're, coming in worst case scenario saying, I will not compensate at all. I had someone this week who I met at an open house last week. They wanted me to put 0% there because they have no plans to compensate. I went to my Real Source meeting in person, and I thought they made it very clear that my buyer's agency has to be the same compensation amount that will be in the offer, and that I would need to amend it to reflect that compensation amount, or it will supersede it and I will get paid what's in my buyer's agency agreement. Do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, now first, I'm not an attorney. Everybody say thank God, because we are not going to do attorney speak. Here's in simple terms what attorneys are saying. You can only get paid what you have on your contract. So if you put 3% on your contract, you get 3%. If you put 0 on your contract, I will slap you silly. Out of love. Guys, yeah, we can't put 0, we can't put a dash on the buyer agency agreement. We can't do it, because that's what you get. I need to be really clear with that. What is stated on the buyer agency agreement that you sign with the buyer is all that you get and only what you get. You can't get more. Now, could you take less? Yes. Should you? Not until the last minute. I'm going to say more often than not, I like to do it because it's the right thing. It's a good business decision, but it's the last thing that I would look to do. Okay. But only what's on that agreement is what we can take.
And then a follow-up question to that would be, so if my buyer's agreement says 3%, we go into contract for 2.5%, but my buyer will not compensate it, I need to amend my agreement with the buyer to 2.5%, correct?
It would probably be best to represent and take care of the buyer, because you're agreeing to take less. Yes.
Okay,
You
thank you.
probably should do that. But that's only if you do that.
Doing multiple properties.
Yes, but remember this. John just brought it up. What if you don't get that house? So make sure it's only for this one property. But of course, now what have you done? You just told the buyer that you're more than happy to work 2.5%. Ruh-roh. Okay?
Yes,
Be
very
very
good. Food for
careful on
thought.
this.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and you kind of, Jen, led right into what Lorianne has put out here. What if I've got my contract signed for 3% and the seller's offering 2.5%? And the buyer says, I'm not paying you your 5%. Well, listen, you're not the only one that can cop an attitude. Right? What do you have in your contract? It says 3%. I'm sorry, Mr. Buyer. You want to cap an attitude? I can cap an attitude too. It says you owe me 3%. Now, how do you want to do that? No, that's an attitude. So as we throw that out, no, the buyer can't do that to you. They've signed a contract that says I get 3%. Now, here's where I would go with it. And this is the point of negotiation, guys. Don't allow a listing broker to negotiate your compensation. Let me say it again. Do not allow a listing broker to negotiate your compensation. Now, here's what I mean by that. It's exactly what Jen, you and Lori both put here. My buyer needs to get me 3%. My buyer has decided to get me compensated by asking the seller to pay it. So let's say I send it over to the listing broker. And guys, we're gonna do this with $100,000 house. I mean, those are still readily available. Thank you, because I can't see everybody's faces here. But it'll be the simplicity of the math, right? So the 100,000, I got a seller who's authorized 0 in regards to compensation. Buyer says, I don't want to see homes where the seller's offering no compensation. I go, well, I can definitely follow obedience, fiduciary responsibilities. I can follow what they say. However, is that really what the buyer should do? I'm going to say no, because say, well, buyer, remember, we can always ask the seller to pay. The worst that comes out is we can't come to an agreement and we go find another home. So instead of just not even looking at it, let's go look, see if it's the right home. If it is, let's see if we can negotiate a contract. Buyer agrees to it. So we go out, we take a look at the house, they fall in love with it, and we go, we'll give you your 100,000, and seller, you got to contribute 3% toward the buyer's broker's fee. Okay? Now, we take that to the listing broker. Listing broker says, Darwin, we weren't offering compensation. Well, I understand, but in the past, we asked for concessions. Those were never advertised either, but we sold a lot of homes with concessions. So I'm just asking you, present this to your seller, see what he says. So he takes his seller with my basic description to that. And the buyer says, well, wait a minute. We said we were not going to offer any compensation. Now, as we describe this agent's pretty good. He says, well, okay, well, let's see what we could do. So he says, Darwin, my seller says he's got to reject the offer, but he's willing to make a counter offer. So the question is do you really need that the compensation paid? Oh yeah, that's the easiest way for my buyer to buy this house. Otherwise, he's got $3,000 he's got to pull out of his pocket, and that's not going to happen. He says, okay. So he says, seller, I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and make this. One, you reject the offer. And guys, yes, use this. It's a rejection of the offer. If you make any changes, there's a rejection of the offer. Now, I'm going to suggest you reject the offer, but let's counter to them that for 103, that you'll pay the compensation. Seller goes, well, gee, that seems to make sense. I get 100 either way. Only this way I get my house sold. I'll do that. So now the offer gets sent back to me. counted at 103. They just added the $3,000 that I get paid. I take it to my buyer. I said, buyer, I got bad news and I got good news. Bad news is he rejected your offer. Now, even when you say that, it's like wind's just taken right out of your sails. So yes, this is presentation, guys. This is negotiating. This is sales, but it's helping people get what they want. And that statement just kind of gave them a feeling of how much they wanted that house. So I say, bad news is the seller had to reject your offer. The good news is he's accepted everything except for one, and that's the purchase price. He said that if you guys will pay 103, he's good with all the other terms on the agreement. What's a buyer going to say at that point? Oh, well, that's all. And they sign the agreement. Guys, this is negotiation. This is sales skills. And yes, you're going to have to teach the other side how to present this. But what I just did was I did not allow the listing broker or the seller to negotiate my compensation. Because let's take the worst case scenario. We can't get the seller at no means because he doesn't understand that 103 less 3,000 is 100 or 100 minus 0 is 100, right? Sometimes we got to point it out because they don't have the parachute working, okay? What if it just doesn't happen because they lack gray matter? You still have an option. Did you know that if it really got that bad, talk with the person who's approved the loan, that buyer loan, talk to them and see whether or not they can finance it. Most mortgage programs, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and many others, allow the buyer to finance the $3,000. But now they're paying $3,000 more. No, they would have paid 103. It's not 3,000. Nothing's changed, guys. All the way around, nothing has changed. There's lots of ways to negotiate the contract and for you and I to still get paid. So let's keep it simple from that aspect. I'm going to check to see what we got in the chat room here real quick. If I have a listing in an unrepresented, oh, that question came up, John. Yep. I am still confused. So I'm looking at the chat box here, guys, with Danette's. I'm still confused on how to handle if I have a listing and an unrepresented buyer wants to make an offer. Maybe it's from an open house. Now, there's a real key here is that you've got the listing. I understand I don't need an agreement with the buyer to show the house. Absolutely correct. But I do have an agreement with the buyer in order to double dip. But do I have to have? What's the answer? No. Okay. I should set up polls in this. I got to figure out how to do that to see what everybody would respond to this. So here's Lori's question with that scenario. She's a listing agent. Buyer walks in, unrepresented. Does Lori need to have a buyer agency agreement stating how much she gets paid from the buyer? Otherwise, does she have to force the buyer into being represented? I have 4 no's here, and that is the right answer. You do not have to do that, Danette. It is not necessary for you to do that. Might even be best that you don't do that. But here's the key. You see, you signed an agreement with a seller that says, I get 6%. And you're authorizing me to offer 3% out to basically whoever brings the buyer, either as a buyer's broker or as a transaction coordinator. Well, in this case, you're the seller's agent. You still get both sides because that's what the listing agreement says. Okay? So that's actually a great question on that one, Danette. And that looks like all of those.
Hey, Darwin. Darwin.
Yeah, so let me clarify and then I'll come to that question for you, Larry. Yeah, just a clarification, that buyer does need to have an agency disclosure that would state that you represent the seller. Okay, so you still would need that in that scenario. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
Your equation that you use for the $100,000, you know, I agree with what you're saying and what you did. But when you get up to a $400,000 or $500,000 house, and now that extra 3% added,
It's no,
added,
yeah, it's no longer a 3,000, it's 15,000.
now you're getting the house appraised, and it doesn't appraise for that additional 15. Then what happens?
Well, let me ask you this. Because Larry, you've been in the business long enough to remember this. What happened when you negotiated to have 6% in, well, no, I'll leave it at the same, 3% in concessions, but it didn't appraise? We would renegotiate, potentially. But normally we would call up and I'd go, hey, Lori, great news. You use this all the time. Great news, the appraisal's back. Bad news, we're 4,000 short or 10,000 short, or here, let's go in the middle, $7,500 short. I leave it for that, and I hope that Lori doesn't just say, oh, well, let me see what the sellers will do, because that would not be good. She's our company, right? But you would be surprised at how many agents would go back, oh, well, let me see what I can do with the seller, and they just come back and say, okay, we'll reduce the price. Now, that would be ideal, but that's not what we would want representing a seller. But for my buyer, I would want that. Now, what would we do if it was short $7,500 and we had a good agent on the other end? We start to negotiate and we figure out a way to be able to do this. Now, if it was labeled concessions, have we had deals fall apart because it appraised less? Yep, they fell apart. So what I've been sharing with everybody to help understand what to do, if it wasn't labeled compensation, but it was labeled concession, what would you do? So now in the future, when it says concessions, or there's no longer concessions, but it's compensation, is it possible that we're going to have to walk away? Yeah. Is it possible we might give a few $100s because it's one, it's the right thing to do because of the people, the circumstances, or it could be the right thing to do because it's a good business decision. We've always done it. Yeah, and Peter's saying, look, we get to the point where there's really no choice, but the best thing to do would be to help, because the buyer gave a little bit, the seller gave a little bit, and we're, say, $1,000 apart. Hello. That's a good business decision now because we got it that far. So, simplistic answer, do what we've always done when we call them concessions. Only now we're dealing compensation, but here's what we also know. We turn back to a normal market, we're going to be dealing with both concessions and compensation. But remember this one thing, everybody's dealing with compensation. Everybody's having to negotiate compensation, okay? In an open house situation, don't you need to do, ooh, Nancy, an interesting question. And the answer is no. And the reason being is to have dual agency, notice the point of emphasis, agency, I would have to represent both parties. So I've already represented the seller, but I don't need to represent the buyer. And so the simple answer is that. But if I already have my listing and the buyer says, nope, I'm only going to do it if you represent me too. Well, it's a lot easier for me to represent both and me to work with me. I think that's in the benefit of my seller. I would go to a dual agency if the buyer insisted. But it's not a requirement. We can't force a buyer to sign and enter into an agency relationship. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. You're welcome. All right, the last thing I really want to show you today is the updated purchase agreement. So minor adjustments. And guys, you want to make sure that you have the one that would be dated. Let's see if it's, I think this is mine. You need this for 8/13 or later, and I believe if it's if we updated that at the bottom, They're all submitted. Dot loop, transaction desk, Remind Docs Plus, they're all submitted. And obviously, how long is it going to take for those to get into the system? Well, look, we were way ahead of everybody else and we had things, and what we've got works great. We're just making these minor adjustments to make it easier as we keep moving forward. So it could be a few days if it's Remind Docs Plus. It could be weeks potentially if it's transaction desk, because obviously they're overloaded with all of us who had to make these last minute changes. So what's available to you with this purchase agreement, it's in the OneDrive minimum. What my suggestion would be, most of the managers have forwarded it to you as agents to save the blank. It's a fillable PDF. So save it as you get it and then label it to the name of the property, whatever you want to label it, and save it with that address once you've got it complete. You can then upload it to both Transaction Desk to Remind Docs Plus to where you can send it off for signatures. Okay? Now, what you'll see, paragraph 5 is real simple. The first one is seller. The second one is the listing broker, and the third one is the buyer. That should give you an indication as to where we believe that it is easiest, best, and simplest. Is it for the buyer to build it into their purchase agreement, checking off that the seller shall contribute 3% to be credited toward the buyer's broker's fee. Keep it simple. Matter of fact, if the listing broker was offering 0, I just want to know, because you guys do have the answer to this already. The listing broker was offering 0, the buyer's following your guidance. How much did the buyer put into, and what do they check? They're going to check the seller, and they're going to put 3%. But Darwin, the seller didn't authorize any. Doesn't matter. This is the buyer's offer to the seller. Seller, do you like it or don't you? If you don't like it, reject it. But give me a counter offer. Just don't screw with the 3%. Right? So obviously I'm not going to present this way, but I'm trying to give you a attitude, a mentality that how we should be looking at this. So if it was 2%, doesn't matter. Seller, 3%. I don't need to go get, well, here, if the seller was authorizing 2.5%, do I get the other 0.5% from the buyer or listing broker? Yeah, but why? The buyer's still making the compensation payment. When you get down to it, they're negotiating. If they didn't pay it here, the seller would have taken 3% if they'd pulled it out of their own pocket. Okay? So it's really, really simple. That's the change. We believe the easiest way to go, educate your buyers to just make it part of their purchase agreement. Seller concessions are there. And the only other that has been a change I know it's on here somewhere. We didn't hide it. I think it's at the very bottom, isn't it? There it is. The 395 is paragraph 44 now. So those are your changes. But the simplicity is in regards to collecting your compensation. And as I've been going to all of the offices, nothing's changed. We could always get it from the listing broker. We could always get it from the seller. We could always get it from the buyer. We could always finance it. But we always got it because of the listing broker. It always said that the seller paid it. But now we've got to say who's going to pay it through the authorization that's been out there or no authorization. But remember this, if you've been with me or you're old enough, ragu, the compensation, it's in there. It's in the transaction. Make it happen. Okay? Now that's what I had for you today. And it is now 12:52. Do we have any other questions, gang? Maybe I should say, what other questions do you have?
Okay, Darwin.
Darwin, can you go back to the purchase agreement where you did the 3% for that the buyer's paying?
Slowly. Paragraph 5. Okay.
Okay, so I am assuming, and I want to be really clear, is that the only box that we're checking?
That would be the only box that you're checking because you're getting all 3% from the seller.
And then you write a purchase agreement and then the seller does not pay the commission. Do you come back to this buyer's broker compensation section? Or
Well,
that's
this
when you
is
start
my purchase.
negotiating?
This is the buyer's purchase agreement.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, I'm good.
Okay. So what we would do is if say the listing broker got it and they're going, hey, my seller said no, he won't pay the buyer broker compensation. I say, well, does he want to sell it? Well, yeah. Well, then, and again, we're assuming that there's no multiple offers, right? But remember, everybody's got to negotiate their compensation. Yours might be a little bit more. Yours could be a little bit less than others. But everybody's got to negotiate it. It's in there. Okay? So let's say there's no multiple offers, there's no competition. They just say, no, he won't pay it. I'm going, well, listen, can you give me, now I've got to educate them. Well, listen, the buyer's got to pay it. That if your seller's willing to sell the house, have him make an offer with it paying that. And that would be a verbal conversation that I'd have with you as the listing broker. And you go back to the seller and you go, quit being stupid. No, okay, I wouldn't say that, would I? But I would say, you know what, Mr. Seller, here, I just had a thought. I was talking to listing or with the buyer's broker. Buyer's got to pay his compensation. They don't have the money to pay out of pocket. They really like to buy your house. What if we increased it? And I'm going to go by the worst case scenario. What if we increased it by the 3%? Would you take it then? Now, unless if there was a real concern about it appraising, would a seller not counter for that? I believe they would. What's our concern? It's still got to appraise. But again, let me reinsert concession instead of compensation. We've already dealt with this in the past. No worries. Buyer knows well in advance, you got to get me paid. And no, I'm not negotiating on it. So listing broker, don't try to negotiate my compensation. The buyer needs this way. And that's the mentality that we've got to have for it. Did that address it then, Lydia?
I'm aware
think I
that
got
this
her.
is a purchase agreement that we are presenting, but I'm thinking
Yeah.
that if that didn't work, do we come back to?
No, because I'm not going to negotiate my compensation.
Got it. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay, is that, obviously there's always potential. What I want to emphasize is don't negotiate your compensation. It's not negotiable. They've signed an agreement. They know it. Unless if it's a good decision, it's a good business decision, it's the right thing to do. Don't negotiate your compensation. Get negotiating your compensation out of the formula. It's not negotiable. That's the way I want you guys to see it. Okay? Charge everybody the same. You're doing the same work. It's just that way you're setting a standard that you've got. I think, Jeff, you were coming on, and then Marjorie, I see you got your hand raised. I'll come to you.
Okay.
Okay, please forgive me if we went over this, but we can't go over it enough times, correct?
You
So
got that right.
I am the listing agent on a property. I get an offer to purchase on my property from a purchase agreement that does not look anything like our purchase agreements, correct?
You got it.
The purchase agreements in other The buyer's agent has written that the seller will pay the buyer broker 3%. In my listing agreement with my seller has already agreed to give Century 21 6% and allowing us to give 3% to a buyer broker and or transaction coordinator. My first thought is to have them take that out of other and send them a compensation agreement between brokers. Is that correct?
Actually, Jeff, we would probably prefer to keep it part of the purchase agreement. And
Because the reason I ask is this has happened twice in 2 days. And the seller is like, well, I'm not paying 9%.
you got it. So the obvious
So-
part is when we're on the listing side, I would have a change in how I see that section. So the seller is authorizing 6%. The seller is authorizing of that 6% to offer 3%. But it would be not that it's 3% of our 6%. It is 3% of their money, but we know if somebody else gets 3%, we're only getting 3%. But if we have both sides, we're getting the 6%.
Okay,
So it would be maybe an explanation or something in writing with a seller that says, no, seller, you can accept this way, and we are only taking 3%. And I
okay,
do
so
anticipate a seller saying that.
So the reason I'm being so specific about this is because it says on other that seller will pay 3% of purchase price to buyer broker.
Yep.
So if you read the contract, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, it shows that they're paying 3% to the buyer broker and 6% to Century 21.
And so everybody knows we're not going to do that to a seller. We're not going to do that. We're going to look at it at 6 and 3. So it's an offer of compensation to a buyer's broker, and it doesn't say that necessarily. And this, Jeff, you and I think when I say this, you'll understand it. I was hoping for better language that would come out. I just haven't seen it, and I'm not an attorney. So what we know is we want to see this as the seller's paying us 3 and offering 3 out. So not 6 and then they get asked for, because what we are pretty confident of is most purchase agreements are going to have the buyer requesting that the seller pay the compensation. We just happen to be ahead of it. And matter of fact, I was with the Knockboard Education Committee yesterday, and nobody else that I'm aware of had it a part of the purchase agreement already.
Okay,
So
so
we're ahead of everybody else by building it in.
in this scenario that I told you that has happened twice now, once yesterday, once today, the buyer's agent was happy to take that out of the purchase agreement once we sent them the
Yes.
compensation
Cooperating, yep.
agreement between brokers from the Michigan Realtors form.
Yep. It is a way of doing it, but now I ask you this. From the point of the listing broker, how much more paperwork, time, and so on does that create on our side? Because how is that going to be handled the time of compensation or the closing? And I'm thinking of the number of title people that I've talked to and said, how will you guys handle the buyer's broker's fee being compensated by the listing broker? Now, I could say 9 out of 10 didn't have an answer for me, and I've been asking for about the last 5 weeks. 2 weeks ago, I asked one, and she was not in a decision-making position, but what she said was, I believe what we would do is make it part of the closing instructions that ABC Realty listing broker to bring a check in the amount of $9,000 made payable to Century 21 Row. I said, well, what if they didn't bring it? She says, then we don't close. I'm going, well, that only happened once. I don't want it to happen all. And that's why we're kind of leaning toward best if they do just make it part of the purchase agreement. And I think as we move forward, I think you're going to see probably upwards of 90% of them being taken care of that way.
Okay, now my next question is, so in line 40 other on somebody else's purchase agreement, can they put that compensation, buyer agent compensation comes from listing broker?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I will tell you that I was talking with a mortgage person yesterday, and I wish I'd have got 100% on this. My mind just shifted. It was the mortgage market that was bringing this clarification. It was that the buyer broker compensation had to be part of the purchase agreement, meaning this, specifying who and how much. And so if it was the buyer, it needed to be stated. If it was the seller, it needed to be stated. And I said, well, what about in the case of the listing broker paying compensation? He said, huh? Apparently nobody had thought of that. And I said, well, look, here's what is out there. And I showed him our generic compensation agreement. And then I showed him what we've done with the purchase agreement here. And he says, oh, no, that's beautiful because it covers all three of the directions where we could get compensation from. And with the way that we've worded it, it's, hey, it's coming from the listing broker and see the cooperating broker compensation agreement. And he said, well, from everything he understood, that should take care of it. So it really, they probably a little bit ahead, but now you can get an idea as to why we're ahead of pretty much everybody by having this part of the purchase agreement. Okay? All set, Jeff? Marjorie, if you didn't forget your question, you're on.
Yeah, I almost forgot. But just real quick, and I don't want to take up a whole lot of time because we've been on a long time, but can you just explain, Darwin, what it means when you hear no broker to broker compensation, and how are we handling that when you hear that from a listing agent?
No, I don't want to take care of that one. That one's easy.
Okay.
What I've been saying in recent weeks, because it became readily obvious there's going to be more and more brokers that are not going to sign compensation agreements. So
Right.
when you hear that the listing broker is not offering compensation, they're saying, don't try to get us to pay the buyer broker fee. I'll interpret it further. Your buyer needs to get it from the seller or some other source.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when you see that, it doesn't mean that there's no compensation. It means that the listing broker is not going to be responsible for the payment of it.
Mm-hmm.
But they may have got an agreement with the seller that authorizes them to promote that 3% is out there. I'm actually putting in my own mindset, you'll hear in my verbal judo that I'm using the offer of compensation. And when I complete it further, I'm saying the seller's offer of compensation, because the seller's authorizing the compensation.
Right.
So if we begin to think of it from that direction, even with what, Jeff and I was discussing there, it helps understand why we can do it the way that we're doing it, because it's the seller authorizing the compensation. So if you do see it to where the listing broker is saying we're not offering it, that just means they're not going to pay it.
Right.
Otherwise, it should be zero. Now, I will tell you that last night in kind of studying for today, I was watching a number of reels regarding the NAR settlement and the compensation. You will find that there are those that are out there that have a mindset that says, You can call me and ask, but I'm not gonna tell you, okay? Now, I haven't heard that our area yet, but one of them was an EXP that sounded like it was a kind of an EXP, we'll call it, thought process. Obviously, it can't be a directive from up top unless if it's their broker, their one broker in Michigan, right? But their thought was is that, Marjorie, you could call me and ask me what my offer of compensation is. And I'd say, well, we're not actually doing that. We're not going to tell you. Well, their thought is the old, I'm tipping my hat. I'm telling you, they got 3% in here. Well, let me go back. I didn't do it today with these guys, did I? Let me throw this out real quick. Now, hang with me. Don't just hear this one thing. You got to hear the whole part. You ready? Everybody's listening. I don't care what they're offering. It doesn't matter to me. I have a contract that says I get 3%. My buyer's been informed and understands and wants to be able to get me compensated by asking the seller to pay it in the purchase agreement. But my fiduciary duties hold it my responsibility to find out from the listing broker what offer of compensation is, because that's due diligence and it might change how we might negotiate on a property they've selected, or whether or not they even make an offer. Me personally, I could care less, but the buyer needs to know. That hopefully helps clarify that a little bit further. Okay? And I see some smiles out there. Thank you, Jamie, for that smile.
Thank
I
you.
got a question here, guys.
Going to be using now notice of buyer agency.
The old notice of buyer agency. I'm going to tell you that I believe if you look on that at the bottom, there's a date and the year is 2014. It might be older. Is it 2014, John? Do you know? I think
Something
it's
like
2000.
that.
It's at
Something like
least
that.
2014. It could be older. So what I would tell you is that we were using it for a different source than what it needed to be used for. And I won't even get into that, but it's not the document to use. Just put it into PA. Then we don't even have to worry about the offer of compensation from the listing broker. We don't need a signed agreement because it's part of the purchase agreement. Okay? So the notice of buyer agency, not the document to use any longer. Boot that out. Boot that out. Okay? Any other questions? We got everybody set? Well, here's where we'll continue to move, everybody. I want you to know that you know that you know. I want you to know that you know that you know. That's where all of this is trying to take you. And guys, I'm going to tell you, you are head and shoulders above the competition. You are so much more ready than everybody else. Know that we're going to have to suffer through with people who don't get this. And we're going to be training others and bringing them up. And I can tell you just from yesterday's meeting, there's a lot of that. You're the best. Go help everybody else in understanding this, train them, make them better, and keep being awesome. And with that, I wish you a wonderful week. Go talk to people. Yeah, absolutely.